Well, I concluded that Freud's influence in this respect has been absolutely decisive. Jung, his great disciple, tried to find his way around this position Freud had adopted and tried to find a more religious, more spiritual interpretation of the psyche, which is one of the reasons Freud and Jung fell out with one another. Most other followers of Freud and the schools that followed the post-Freudians simply assumed that Freud was correct about the connection between the psyche and the natural environment. And the result of that has been, if you look at psychiatric literature as a whole, there's almost no mention in it of the non-human world, as if it just doesn't matter. Indeed, you find extreme examples of this in a development following World War II, existential therapy, for example. It is simply assumed that human beings exist in a condition of alienation from nature. Indeed, that's the key problem that you have to address yourself to, our profound alienation as human beings in an alien universe. Well, I decided to go back beyond Freud and then to place his work within a larger framework of spiritual healing, psychotherapy in the most general sense of the term. Because if you look beyond the modern Western schools of psychiatry, you find that in traditional societies, among primary people, the people we once used to call primitives, that it is understood that sanity and madness have to be defined always in relationship to the natural habitat. And that indeed, to a very large extent, madness is understood to be an imbalance between the individual and the natural environment, or between an entire tribe or a people and its natural environment. That's a much larger conception of what sanity and madness are. And so my feeling is that the indigenous cultures have a lot to offer our understanding of sanity and madness in this one significant respect, that there has to be a balance between the psyche and the natural world around us. That, I think, has profound ecological implications.
Well, one of the really controversial issues in modern psychiatry and psychology is the whole issue of the social system itself. What happens when the social system is mad or insane? Yeah. Can you have sane people?
Yeah, Freud also addressed himself to this issue, asking the question, how do we define madness if we decide, if we suspect that an entire culture may be embedded in what he called collusive madness or communal neuroses? Where does the therapist then look for a baseline to define sanity and madness? Freud raised this issue. He never came up with a successful answer to it. Later schools, like radical therapists have, they have called into question the existing social definition of madness and sanity in ways that have profound social implications. Perhaps an entire society is mad, in which case you don't simply want to adjust people back into another condition of madness. The way in which I take this issue up is to suggest that there is a madness involved in urban industrial society that has to do with our lack of balance and integration with the natural environment. That this might be an interesting baseline to use for the definition of sanity as we move into the next century. That is, we need to recapture that sense of being embedded in nature, being in a condition of reciprocity with nature that you do find in traditional forms of healing. Now, I don't think we can simply adopt any other culture's conception of sanity and madness. We have to work out our own. And that, I want to suggest, is as much a job of the ecologist as it is of the therapist. So ecopsychology is the term I've used to try to define a common ground between two fields that have so far not been on speaking terms. Psychologists on the one side, and ecologists on the other. Psychology needs ecology, ecology needs psychology. Ideally, you know, someday we wouldn't use a term like eco-psychology. Psychology would be understood to have an ecological framework. But at this point, that is still to be worked out.
At this point, we have ecologists who are like prophets in the wilderness, warning us that the course our civilization is taking on a global basis is madness, that we're headed for self-destruction, that we are fouling our habitats.
At a deep level, the human psyche is grafted to the planet out of which we evolved, that there is what I call an ecological unconscious. Now, whenever we invoke the unconscious, the depths of the unconscious, what we're essentially doing is pursuing a philosophical discussion of human nature. We're asking what makes people tick, what are the foundations of human behavior. And there's been, of course, a lot of speculation about that throughout the psychiatric the tradition. Some people find sexuality there, others find the archetypes of the high religious traditions there. I'm suggesting that at a certain level of the unconscious mind, what we find is ecological wisdom, and that indeed, if that were not there, our species could not have survived and evolved as it has. I have floated this phrase, suggested this phrase as a hypothesis, so that the lowest level, the deepest level of the unconscious mind, we find an ecological unconscious, deeper down even than Freud's ideas about sexuality or Jung's ideas about religious archetypes, something that connects us intimately, companionably, with the flora and fauna, the mountains, the rivers, the natural world around us.